Hey everyone, it's Wojo, and welcome back to another quick algebra lesson. Today we're going to be looking at factoring trinomials. Factoring trinomials is a real important skill. It helps us solve quadratics, helps us solve and graph quadratics for that matter, helps us solve more complicated physics problems, manufacturing optimization problems, design problems. It's just a really good skill to have. And so what we're going to look at today is pretty simple in the introduction to how to factor a trinomial. If you remember, the word factor just means make a multiplication problem. What multiplies to give me x squared plus 7x plus 12? You've heard the word factor before. If I say, well, list factors of 24, for example, you know that numbers that multiply to 24 might be 2 and 12. And so they say 2 and 12 are factors of 24. It could be 3 and 8 and 4 and 6. There could be multiple factors. For trinomials, there's going to be one set of factors that works for something like this. Now, not every trinomial is factorable, so it's important to know you can have prime polynomials, ones that can't be factored anymore as well. But we just want to kind of get the sense of how to factor a trinomial. To factor a trinomial, you kind of have to understand how the multiplication works. So I just want to go back quickly and remind you, if I gave you a problem like this, x plus 3 times x plus 4, and I asked you to multiply those two binomials together. Remember, a binomial has two terms. We would multiply by just distributing the x and the 3 in this set of parentheses over to the x and the 4 in this set of parentheses. So if you think about it, x times x gives us x squared. X times 4, if I multiply the x times the 4, that gives us a 4x. And then we can come back through, now that we've distributed the x to both terms, we can now come back and distribute the 3 to both terms. So 3 times x is 3x, 3 times 4 is 12. And then we talk about this idea of like terms. So if you look at the 4x and the 3x, they're both x's, so we can add them together. We know what 4x plus 3x is. X squared stays the same, 4x and 3x makes 7x. Plus 12. So one of the things that I notice that I think is important for you guys to notice as well is that when I multiply two binomials together, so x plus 3, x plus 4, my solution, my answer, is a trinomial. And that helps me when I want to work backwards. So if I, sorry about that, you can't see it. If I look at a trinomial to begin with, like x squared plus 7x plus 12, and my job, my answer today is going to be this. I know that if a trinomial is what I'm given, maybe the things that were multiplied together were two binomials. And so when I say factor, like the example said, factor x squared plus 7x plus 12, in my head I'm thinking, oh, that's a trinomial. All right, so I have this idea that's a trinomial. Well, where could a trinomial have come from? Oh, it came from two binomials. Now, I might not know the numbers that go in there, but I do know that that's the setup, that the setup is something plus something and something minus something, or it could be plus again. So then I can begin kind of the thought of the day. So again, our target today is how do I factor a trinomial? And so when I see factoring x squared plus 7x plus 12, in my head, my thought bubble is, all right, that's a trinomial. There's three terms, 1, 2, 3. That's what makes it a trinomial. So it probably came from a binomial. So then I start thinking about the pieces. How do I get an x squared? Well, to get an x squared, I got it from an x multiplied by an x. So I could just kind of start plotting or putting down what I think might be here. And so in this case, I'm going to put an x here and an x here because x times x is x squared. Now I have to do a little bit trickier part, which is trying to figure out what numbers I could put here that I'm going to get a 12 and a 7. Now, sometimes we call these factor x. Some of you may have seen these x's before, some not. But there's two numbers that we have to deal with here, the 12 and the 7. And so I could just put those numbers on the top and the bottom. I usually put the last number on top and the middle number on the bottom. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to think about where the 12 and 7 came from. How did I get 12 when I multiplied these together? It was this times this. So in my head I'm thinking, can I think of two numbers that times or multiply to 12? And so, of course, there's multiple options. There's 1 times 12 would give me 12. 2 and 6 give me 12. 3 and 4 give me 12. So how do I know which one of those combinations work? Well, then I have to think about, well, where does this 7 come from? Well, if you think about this 7 came from this 4 added to this 3. So it's numbers that multiply to 12 and add to 7. So in my head, I'm thinking, can I think of numbers that multiply to 12 and add to 7? We'll put up a resource for you guys to kind of look at. I know you guys know the answer to this one, but we have a resource that has all the different multiplications or factors of all the numbers. And so sorry about that. If I look at, you're just looking at my ceiling there. If I look at the number 12 and I zoom in on it, the numbers that multiply to 12 are 1 and 12. Well, those don't add up to 7. 2 and 6, well, 2 plus 6 is 8, so that's not an option. 3 and 4, well, what's 3 plus 4? 3 plus 4 is the 7 that I was looking for. And so now I know that the numbers that I need to make this trinomial are going to be 3 and 4. And so then I can just come back here and place those numbers. They're both positive numbers. So I know it must have been x plus 3 times x plus 4 that led me to that trinomial. And that's kind of the idea of how this works. We're just going to try to work our way backwards to figure out kind of how that works. Let's look at another example really quick. And hopefully that will make some more sense to you. Sometimes it gets a little trickier if there's negative numbers involved. But before we do any of those, let's just think about one more. So let's make this our second example. I just want to remind you guys that you're always welcome to reach out to us. If you have questions, we're available by email. You can stop in and talk to us in our Google Meets and Zoom sessions as well. But what if I asked you to factor x squared plus 8x plus 12? So that's a problem you're going to be looking at. Maybe we got to factor it to help us solve a quadratic later. And so you just know that you need to break it down. Having it broken down makes a lot of the math simpler. Dealing with x squareds can be tough. Having just x's is much nicer. So what do we notice? We notice we have a trinomial. There's 3 terms here. And so we've already talked about this trinomial probably came from a binomial times a binomial. And so then we just look at the pieces. How did we get an x squared? Well, we got an x squared from an x getting multiplied across this parenthesis to another x here. Notice the x has to be in this other one. It couldn't be here because we wouldn't multiply these two together. This is going to be x plus something or x minus something. So x times x is going to give me the x squared that I wanted. Now, how am I going to get the 12 and the 8? And so again, if you like this idea of setting this factor x up, you can. The number 12 is the numbers that they're going to multiply to, so I put those on top. So I need numbers that multiply to 12 that combine or add or subtract to 8. And so I just start thinking of numbers that multiply to 12. We already had 3 and 4, but 3 and 4 wouldn't add to 8. So can you think of numbers that multiply to 12 that would combine to 8? Well, 1 and 12 would combine to 13. 2 and 6, yeah, 2 plus 6 is 8, and 2 times 6 is 12. So if I wanted to take that 2 and 6, if I put those in here, I just kind of fill in my blanks as I go. I just realized that if I said x plus 2 times x plus 6, I would get this answer. So this would be my final answer. We would be done if it asked us to factor. Because if I multiply these back out, I would get this. X times x gives me the x squared. X times 6 only gives me a 6x, but then I also have a 2 times x that gives me another 2x. So my 6x's plus my 2x's gives me the 8x, and then 2 times 6 is 12. And so that's what we're going to be asking you guys to do this week, is just work on your factoring of trinomials. We'll look at 2 more quick examples, and then we'll leave it for questions from there. So let's look at one that has some negatives in it to see if it makes it any harder. Factor x squared minus 6x minus 16. So again, when you see the word factor, I want you to think about what that says. Factor. I need to come up with the multiplication problem. The reason why this is a multiplication problem is parentheses next to parentheses with no sign in between means we're multiplying it together. When I have a trinomial with 3 pieces, I know more than likely this came from a binomial times a binomial because we did a lot of practice multiplying binomials times binomials, and they almost always resulted in a trinomial. There's a couple cases where they don't. We call those special cases. We'll look at those later. So again, maybe you guys got a good sense of it now. How am I going to get an x squared? It's going to be an x here in the first part of this parenthesis and an x here in this part of the parenthesis. Now, how am I going to make the minus 6x and the minus 16? So remember, if I want to think about those numbers separately, I need something that's going to multiply. Now, when I say something, I need 2 numbers. They're going to multiply to negative 16 that are going to combine either through adding or subtracting to negative 6. This can be a little bit tougher to think about. I think the hardest part of doing these problems is coming up with these number combinations. And so again, we'll have this linked on our classrooms here. But if you look at the sheet and I go to 16, you always want to look at the sheet at the top number, the numbers or the last number, because this sheet just helps us with all the numbers that multiply to negative 16. In this case, we're going to look at positive 16 because there's no negatives on here. So if I go to the 16 list, remember our goal is to look at any numbers that multiply to 16. So the numbers that multiply to 16 are 1 and 16, 2 and 8, 4 and 4, 8 and 2, and 16 and 1. So you read those straight up and down. I need numbers that combine to give me a negative 6. So chances are I'm going to be adding, or not adding, but subtracting here because I need to get negatives. So if I did 1 plus 16, that's not going to give me a negative 6. If I did 1 minus 16, that doesn't give me a negative 6. If I go to the next column, so I'm just moving over, 2 plus 8 gives me 10. 2 minus 8, well, what's 2 take away 8? 2 take away 8 is negative 6. And that's the number that I wanted here was negative 6. So I can now look at this and say, oh, I know the numbers that multiply to negative 16 that combine to negative 6. It's a positive 2 and a negative 8. And again, you can just check this with the calculator. What's 2 times negative 8? Negative 16. What's 2 minus 8? That's negative 6. So my answer here is going to be plus 2 and a negative 8. And so that's kind of how you use that sheet, just to kind of help you out. The time you're going to be practicing today is probably going to be practicing trying to use that sheet and making sense of it. A lot of these you might be able to do in your head, and so if you can do them in your head, that's fantastic. You could just really quickly double check by just multiplying it out. X times x is x squared. X times negative 8 is negative 8x. 2x and 2 times negative 8 is negative 16. When I combine these together, I get negative 6x. Your answer should be the same as the problem at the beginning. If they're the same, then we did a good job, and then we got the right kind of answer. All right, let's finish up with one other one just to kind of round it out. If you feel like you got the idea by now, like always, feel free just to hop off and try some problems. We did provide a couple different ways for you guys to do problems this week. You can look at it and do the problems on the PDF worksheet. The answers are at the bottom, and you could also just go right to the quizzes and see if you can just do well just by looking at this quick video. Let's finish up our last problem, x squared minus 9x plus 20. Once again, what are numbers that multiply to 20 that give me a negative 9? Like always, we have x's in the front because x times x is what gives me x squared. And then numbers that multiply to 20. Well, I know 4 times 5 is 20, and 4 plus 5 is 9, but I need a negative 9, not a positive 9. And so I could use 4 and 5, but that gives me a positive 9. To fix that, just make both of these negative. A negative times a negative still gives me a positive, but then the negative 4 minus 5 gives me the negative 9. Because these are negative numbers, it's minus 4 here and minus 5. By the way, you could have x minus 5 first and the x minus 4 second. Everything in all of these could be reversed, but the positive would have to be the 2 in this case. The negative would have to be the 8. So the signs matter, but the spot that they're in doesn't. I hope this helps. I hope you guys have a pretty good understanding of how to factor trinomials. When you're all set and you've done enough practice, try that quizzes to see how you're doing. Email us questions if you have any. Thanks.